Early here, but the 6 o'clock start time, but that's okay for Monday afternoon. It's Monday, the 24th of April in the year 2023. If you are following live on different websites, it's because of Restream.io. Restream.io allows me to broadcast at the same time to Facebook and Twitch, but not Facebook for I'm still banned from going live, but at SSB Tabernacle, and YouTube at Andy Liberty UO, and Twitter at boring_plane. This is Richard. You don't have to open it. You just open there. Just leave them in there. This is Scriptural Salvation Baptist Tabernacle. My name is Andy. Welcome to my living room. Sitting right in front of me, I have Richard and Paul. To my right, I have Steve. Off camera are Hannah, Jacob, Grace, my wife Liz, and our dog Sweetheart. And without further ado, we will get into the first musical number of the week. This is Morning into Dancing, not morning like the sun's coming up, but mourning like you're in mourning for something tragic. And it's from a Bible verse about He turns my mourning into dancing. So in the Lord, we're able to take things that are tragic and turn them into things that are not. And I urge you that if you're not able to listen to this song when it comes through now, go through and look it up on your own. So Morning into Dancing. Oops. Let me have this ready to go. All right, ready, and Okay, so we've been speaking in the book of Leviticus, so we will continue on. We're almost done in said book. So with that, this is our 8th lesson in the book of Leviticus, and it covers chapters 24 and 25. And this is part 2 of Psalm 78. So part 1 was verses 1 through 12. This is verses 13 through 24. And it begins with Richard.
He divided the sea. He divided the sea and let them pass through it, and made the waters stand like a heap. In the daytime he led them with a cloud, and all the night with a fiery light.
Fiery. Very good. Out. So that is actually describing the Exodus when they crossed the Red Sea.
Oh,
He divided the sea and let them pass through it.
It's been lost today.
So he split rocks in the wilderness and gave them drink abundantly as from the deep. He made streams come out of the rock and caused waters to flow down like rivers.
Yes, they
Sinned.
sinned more, still more, against him, rebelling against the Most High in the desert. They tested God in their heart by demanding the cave.
Great.
Crave.
Yeah.
They spoke against God, saying, "Can God spread a table in the wilderness? He struck the rock so that water gushed out and streams overflowed. Can he also give bread or provide meat for his people?"
Therefore, when the Lord heard, he was full of wrath. A fire was kindled against Jacob. His anger rose against Israel because they did not believe in God and did not trust his saving power. Yes, he commanded
Commanded.
the skies above and opened the doors of heaven. And he rained down on them many to eat and gave them the grain of heaven.
Oh yeah.
Pretty good, but
Hannah
other-
and Grace.
Richard.
Hey, Hannah. Just hang it out.
But Richard, that's what I was just about to do. All right, go do what you were going to do. This word here is manna.
What
When
did
we
you
were talking about
Did you say
no.
manna?
when we were talking about in the book of Exodus, the food that the people were given to eat, it was manna. But we don't see that word very often. So,
Getting wobbling down.
okay. I'm going to give you a brief summary of the first 4 verses of chapter 24. Inside the tabernacle was the lampstand, the golden lampstand, also called in Hebrew the menorah. And in this first 4 verses, it gives the recipe for how they make the oil that was inside the menorah that was burned, and also that it had to burn continually. So there was always light inside the tabernacle. The 2 reasons why it's the only light inside the tabernacle, so this big golden lampstand standing there, so they had it burning continually. So that was one of the priest's jobs, was to make sure that there was always oil in the lamp to burn. And also, it foreshadows the Messiah, who would be an eternal light that would always be burning. Jesus came as the light of the world and replaced our need for the golden lampstand. Verses 5 through 9, a brief summary, are about the table for the bread of the presence. And in these verses, it gives a recipe for that bread, and that small detail that most people miss is that you had to add frankincense to each loaf of bread. And the reason you added frankincense to it is it made a pleasing aroma when you cooked it, so it smelled good. Frankincense was used in worship because it smelled good, and the Lord liked it, and it made things ready for sacrifice. The loaves of bread were placed on the table in 2 rows of 6, and the bread was always there. This signified that there was order. They had to keep the bread, make it to a specific way, and put it out in a certain way to display it. And it also signified fellowship. You had to go to the Lord to meet with him and fellowship with this bread. And it was eaten and replaced every Sabbath, so that it wasn't a stale relationship. The need for this bread was replaced with Jesus because he is the bread of life. I don't know why didn't it? That is weird. Now, the lampstand and the bread of the presence, so the 2 actual physical articles, when the temple was destroyed, were taken by the Romans. And there's, on the Arch of Titus in the city of Rome, there's actually a piece carved into it where it shows these items being taken away. So that itself is the Arch of Titus. And this, here, you can see the golden lampstand being carried away. And here, you can see the table of the bread. And they got carried away. I don't know why it did that to me. Now we will listen to verses 10 through 16 of chapter 24. I forgot to do a time stamp when this started. That's okay.
Oh, don't forget to show.
Now it's verses 1 through 9. a little piece about the person that committed blasphemy, and they were going to put him to death. So that's what's important. I don't know why he did that. All right. So the verse, in verse 10, it says, "Now an Israelite woman's son, whose father was an Egyptian." So we're dealing with somebody whose heritage is half Israelite and half Egyptian. And this half and half person gets into a fight with a full-born Israelite, and during the fight commits blasphemy against God. Now this is a violation of commandment number 2. You shall not take the Lord's name in vain. So they take the blasphemer and they put him in custody. So they arrested him and they locked him up. And because this isn't mob rule, they didn't just go and tear him limb from limb right there, or they didn't just go and set him on fire. They took him into custody. They showed restraint. Now the people weren't sure what happened to this person, what should happen to this person if the laws applied to him, because he was half a foreigner. He was half heritage of Israelite, half heritage Israelite. So the Lord tells them, lay your hands on his head and let all the congregation stone him. Whenever somebody received the penalty of stoning in ancient Israel, before the witnesses carried out the stoning, they would walk up to the person, they would have their hands tied behind their back, and they would be put in a pit, and they'd be standing and buried up to their waist, and they'd be standing there, and the people that witnessed their crime that was eligible for the death penalty would walk up and put their hands on his head. It's very similar to when you sacrificed animals, and you had to put your hand on the animal's head before you sliced its throat. Here, you're putting your hand on a human head so that you're not as willing to just go through with, yeah, we need to kill this guy. You're walking up and you're reminding yourself that this is a human. I feel their hair. I know this person. But they committed a crime that the Lord prescribed death. So all the witnesses, though in this case, everybody walked up and they put their hand on his head. So it was so you would recognize the accused and feel familiarity with them. Probably the reason that this half-breed thought that it was okay to blaspheme against God is because Egyptians cursed their gods all the time. They were perfectly okay with saying a curse against one of their many gods. But what this does is shows that our God, Yahweh, Elohim, El Elyon, El Shaddai, is not the same as these Egyptian gods. Our God stands head and shoulders above any of these gods. It's a powerful display to take anybody, even a foreigner, and take them out and stone them to death. And what happened was the people saw that you could even take a foreigner and stone them to death. And what it did was make it so that your average run-of-the-mill Israelite would find different ways around even saying God's name. They held it in such reverence. They didn't want to accidentally say it in case it turned out to be a curse, that they would abbreviate it with YHWH, just like that, YHWH, and it became so mysterious to them that they forgot how to pronounce it. They wouldn't even say it out loud. They would write it like that so that they weren't accidentally cursing the name of the Lord. And for hundreds of years, when the Israelites went into exile and when they were gone, they forgot how to say this name. And that's kind of how the saying Jehovah, when people started saying that the way you say the Lord's name is Jehovah, is because people that weren't Hebrew came in and tried to say it. So that's where part of where Jehovah comes from, which is not. I know we sing the song where it says there's no God like Jehovah. Well, that's not an actual word. It's somebody thought they were making up, or that they were saying the word of the Lord right.
Mm-hmm.
They were not.
Wop, wop.
Paul.
Funny.
Now we will listen to verses 17 through 23. All right. You'll have to excuse everybody with the coughs and the sniffles.
Sorry.
No, Paul, that doesn't mean you do it. Okay. That's what it sounds like you do. All right. Verses 17 through 23 of chapter 24. Bless you. Whoever takes a human life shall surely be put to death. This command has been given to us before, so here it's repeated for clarity, so that people know that any time you kill somebody, the ultimate penalty for killing somebody is you should be put to death. Life for life, blood for blood. Human life is precious and it's not expendable. It reminds you shouldn't just go running around killing people. It's not the purge. You're not Rambo. You don't need to go run around killing people because human life is precious.
I want to watch
It's not the kid.
Okay, Paul.
No tape.
Richard. Whoever takes an animal's life shall make it good. And what that means is you don't kill somebody for killing an animal. There's a system in place for if an ox is killed, you replace it with this many oxen. If a donkey is killed, you replace it with this many donkeys. So the system in place to replace the animal's value if an animal's life is killed. And that was earlier in the book of Leviticus, we went through that. If anyone injures his neighbor and he has it done, it shall be done to him. Now you've heard an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That was in the code of Hammurabi, but it's also here in the Bible. And here in the Bible, it's limit setting. It means that if somebody breaks your hand, you don't have the legal recourse to kill them. You have the limit is set that if somebody breaks your hand, that the most penalty that can happen to them is their hand being broken as well. Human nature means we're either too kind, so you're afraid to perform the punishment to somebody, or you're too cruel, and you don't just stop with breaking their hand. You go with all kinds of wild and crazy ideas that will just... Yeah. Well, Grace, I was actually. Okay. Yeah. Now, in Hammurabi, when he sets the command eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, it's a command so that everybody that accidentally pokes out somebody else's eye, you immediately run to them and gouge their eye out. But in the Bible, it's a legal limit, and it's the judge who pronounces the sentence. If the judge feels that you have done something that warrants you losing a hand because you caused somebody else to lose a hand, that's the actual maximum sentence that the judge can give to them. It's not like the Code of Hammurabi where everybody that does it has it happen to them. It's just the legal limit. So that's the difference between other ancient codes and the Bible. Get away from that food, dog. Dog.
Sweetie, no.
Ready.
You have the same rule for the sojourner and for the native. So in this section, the Lord is telling everybody that people that are sojourning with you are to be judged the same as the native-born Israelite when it comes to eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, as well as for murder, so that this Egyptian half-breed is supposed to be judged under the same laws as your native-born Israelite. Thus, the people of Israel did as they were told. So this wasn't just Babel saying you do this and you can't do this and you have to do this. This was the Lord telling the people what he expected of them and then carrying through it. So he tells them that this Egyptian who killed somebody and was deserving of death actually received that punishment. So this wasn't just Babel, it was obeying the commands. Now the next chapter is very long. It had over 50 verses in it.
Oh.
So instead of going through and listening to all of it, I've summarized the different sections. And the first section is verse 1 through 7. And what it's saying is that just like during the week, every week you're supposed to have a Sabbath day during the week that you observe, the Israelites also had a Sabbath year. So every 7th year was a Sabbath year. That, no, it didn't mean that through the entire year you couldn't work. And what it meant was the land was given a rest. So your crops on that 7th year, you couldn't plant anything. And this accomplishes two things. Dependence on him, because during that 7th year when you haven't planted anything, you got to get your food from somewhere. You have to rely on the Lord to make sure that you're going to have the food to get through. So it accomplishes dependence, relying on him with faith, but it also gives the land, the nutrients in the soil, time to regenerate. The land belongs to him. You have to trust him and obey his commandments. So that's why every 7 years, the Israelites gave the land a rest. Now, what people and this is actually a technique that I've heard carries on in modern day that farmers still do, is they'll have multiple fields and they'll let one of them, they won't grow anything in that field for a year and let the nutrients grow so that the nutrients can regenerate in the soil, and then the rest of the field they would use. So the Israelites would have 7 fields and they would use 6 of them at a time and move which fields are being used, also with crop rotation, so that you're letting the land rest. You're giving the land a Sabbath. It also levels the playing field. It teaches the Israelites that just like the poor, who need to be dependent on the Lord to be fed, every Israelite every 7 years has to wait because there's not going to be food for them. They have to live just like the poor person. It gives them the same perspective. It gives them compassion so that they know how the poor person goes from day to day every year. They do it once every 7 years. Now, verses 8 through 22, a summary, are you would take 7 of these Sabbath years. So that would be 49 years. 7 Sabbaths, 49 years. Then you would take the next year after that and call it a special year. It would be the 50th year. And this 50th year is called a Jubilee.
Jubilee.
Now, Jubilee doesn't mean great celebration, like many people think it does. We're holding a grand Jubilee. What it actually means is ram's horn, because the ram's horn would be blown during the festival of Jubilee. So that's where that word comes from. So at the start of Yom Kippur, on the 50th year, ram's horns would be blown, marking that year as a Jubilee. So every 50 years, you'd have this year that would be just like a Sabbath year, but you'd be celebrating 2 Sabbaths in a row, this extra special one called Jubilee. And there are different things that happen during it.
Yep.
And verse 25, or chapter 25, verse 10 actually says, proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. And this verse is inscribed on the actual Liberty Bell. If you've ever heard of the Liberty Bell that has a crack in it, it has this Bible verse inscribed on it. The Liberty Bell. Proclaim liberty. Now it goes in a circle, so you can't see it here, but there it is. Proclaim liberty throughout all its inhabitants. So if you wonder where the idea of the Liberty Bell comes from, it comes right from Leviticus. So the year of Jubilee would be the second Sabbath year in a row that the people would be having to go through. So they would have to go through an entire Sabbath year where they're not allowed to plant anything, and then they would have this year of Jubilee, the second year of rest for the land. It shows your dedication to the Lord's commands. If you follow the Sabbath the way that you're supposed to, the Lord will provide for you. But you follow the Jubilee, it's the second one in a row. You have to have real dedication for the Lord to be able to do it. And it also gives the land another rest. It serves as a complete reset for everything. All debts during the Jubilee year are forgiven. Anybody that owed anything, their debts were forgiven. All slaves were free. All contracts were reset. So if you signed a contract for anything, it could only go until the year of Jubilee, and then it was restarted, and you had to sign a new one. And then all land that had been sold was returned to the original owner. And what that was meant was so that the 12 tribes of Israel that owned the land would always keep ownership of the land that they were supposed to inhabit. Now, earlier in Leviticus, we talked about slavery being based on 7-year periods of time, and every 7 years the slavery could end, but the slaves could choose to stay with their masters. But in a year of Jubilee, even those slaves that chose to stay with their masters were freed. All slaves were freed during the year of Jubilee. All contracts that were signed, so building contracts or working contracts, were based on how many years were left until the year of Jubilee. So if it was the first year after year of Jubilee and you wanted to sign on to a building contract with somebody, you could sign a 49-year building contract, but then it would end on the year of Jubilee. And that's how they based all of their contracts, their slavery, everything was based on when Jubilee would happen. So 50-year periods of time. And what that brings up is we need to obey the Lord, even if what he's trying to tell you doesn't make sense. So you're telling me, Lord, that every 50 years, for 2 years in a row, I'm not going to be able to plant any food, and there's going to be nothing growing throughout the entire land. But what that does is it makes you think about the relationship you have with him first. Place that first above what he told you to do. Matthew 6:33 and 34 go a little bit like this. I'm not going to have the thing read it, but Matthew 6:33 and 34 say, "But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. Therefore do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble." Don't worry about if the year of Jubilee is coming. If the Lord commanded you not to plant food, he's going to provide for you. Don't worry if you don't think you're going to have the food for it. The Lord will provide for you. There have been many times, and your mother will attest to this, that I've been afraid that we're not going to have the money to make it through, and we always manage to do it. The Lord is always there for us, and we always find a way. And the lesson that comes with Sabbath years and the year of Jubilee is to always trust the Lord.
Glass breaking.
Now, what Jubilee does is it shows us back to Exodus, but it also gives us a glimpse of Jesus. And the Jubilee, the year that the Exodus happened, the first Passover, was like a Jubilee. The Israelites were slaves in Egypt, and the Exodus, the Passover happened, and the people were set free. It was like a Jubilee. Their slavery ended, and they were allowed to leave. Their contract with the Egyptians was ended in that year of Jubilee during the Passover, the very first Passover. It looks forward to Jesus, because when Jesus comes again, we will no longer be slaves to this life. We will no longer be slaves to sin. Our lives will be freed in Jesus. There are many people that try to track when the year of Jubilee, the next year of Jubilee is supposed to happen, because they think that that's when Jesus will return. This is a faulty method, because when the Israelites were taken into captivity and they left the land of Israel, there's no way to accurately track when the next actual Jubilee is supposed to happen. So, and the Lord also said, don't try to set dates for when he's going to come back. The nation of Israel was freed when God brought them out of slavery in Egypt, just like we as Christians are freed with Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. So Jubilee looks backward to the Exodus and forward to Jesus. The rapture, when all of a sudden we'll be taken in the twinkling of an eye, when the trumpet sounds, will be just like the year of Jubilee, because the trumpet will sound and we'll be taken home, because our contract here on earth will be reset. The land will return to its original owner. Verses 23 through 34 talk about all land belongs to God. And Jubilee proves this. Every 50 years, all land contracts revert back to the original owners, and it's just to show everybody that the land doesn't belong to the people that buy it, it belongs ultimately to God. We're only here as sojourners, but the good thing is that we're here as sojourners with him. As long as we have him with us, guiding us along, we're fine. It shows that he loves and cares for us.
Sojourner.
Traveler. Then it talks about something called the redeeming relative principle. If you were to become indebted and you owed a lot of money, the Israelites are supposed to take their relatives and pay off their debts for them. And what this is a picture of Jesus. He's our ultimate relative that came in. We are in debt and poor to sin, but he pays our debt in full on the cross. When it was finished and our debts are paid, he is the ultimate redeeming relative that came in and paid our debts. Verses 35 through 46 talk about if you have a brother that becomes poor, you can lend money to him, but don't charge him interest on the loan.
It's trash.
You're not supposed to make profits from poor family members. You're not supposed to charge them a loan with high interest so that you make your money back, you scoundrel. You're supposed to treat them like family and just lend them the money, and they'll pay you back when they can. If a family member became your slave, you're supposed to treat them as family. And what this brings up is that slavery was different in the ancient world. We mentioned this before. Going into slavery was common. Anytime you owed a debt that you couldn't pay, instead of not having money and not getting any food and just dying, you would go into slavery you could go into slavery to somebody so you could at least eat. Slavery was better than the alternative, which was death. So the ancient concept of slavery is much different than the concept you're taught of the triangle slave trade and the way things happened in the continent of Africa, where people were just grabbed and thrown onto a ship and brought and forced to labor until they were dead. Here, all slaves were supposed to be treated with kindness because we are ultimately slaves to the Lord. He treats us with kindness. We're supposed to treat people that owe us money with kindness. Foreigners in slavery could be held past the year of Jubilee if their debts weren't paid. So if you had somebody that wasn't a native-born Israelite as your slave, in the year of Jubilee, when all the slaves are freed, you could keep the foreigner as a slave because he still owed you money. So one exception to the year of Jubilee, with everything being reset. The concept of slavery was not kidnapping. It was used as you owed a lot of debt, so you would go into slavery so you could repay it, or in war, instead of being killed in war, you could offer to become their slave. And that's how the Romans built such a massive amount of slaves. That's how the Persians did it. That's how many ancient cultures had the slaves that worked for them was an alternative to being killed in battle. So their view on slavery in the ancient world was much different than is taught as our view of slavery. And the final section comes from verses 47 to 55. And what was expected of is any time one of your Jewish relatives became a slave to a foreigner, you were expected to use the redeeming relative principle to buy them from the foreigner. So anytime somebody that was related to you became a slave to somebody that was a foreign power, you were supposed to come together and buy them back so that they didn't have to stay under foreign rule. And what that proves is that all of us are just slaves to the Lord. He owns all of us, so we're supposed to remember the principles of slavery, treat all slaves kindly, and if somebody that is your family member is under slavery, you're obligated to buy them back. And some of the pictures we looked at were the Liberty Bell. They were the Arch of Titus relief,
The table.
and the actual arch of Titus.
Oh, well, that's what he was talking
And that's actually all I had for the week. We will finish up with a song by Robin Mark, an old one, No, Not by Might. Paul, turn around, please.
No, not by might, nor even power, but by your Spirit, oh Lord. Healer of hearts, binder of wounds, light that our lost restore. Flow through this land, fill every man. Praise is your name once more. Now the whole song can repeat. No, not by might, nor even power, but by your Spirit, oh Lord. Healer of hearts, binder of wounds, light that our lost restore. Flow through this land, fill every man. Great is your name once more. No, not by might, nor even power, but by your Spirit, oh Lord. Healer of hearts, binder of wounds, light that our lost restore. Flow through this land, still every man. Great is your name once more. Flow through this land, still every man. Great is your name once more.
That's a good place. These things may seem like ancient concepts. The concept of a Sabbath year of rest, or the concept of the year of Jubilee where everything resets, or the ancient concept of slavery so that people were allowed to choose a way to live when they had no other means to do it, but they actually are time tested, that they stood through years as things that make sense. And it is here in the Bible that we read about them. I'd like to finish off with a benediction from the book of Numbers. If you watched and you liked what you learned about here, join us again next week. If you watched this and you didn't like it, thank you for sticking with us this long. And that leads us to Numbers chapter 6, verses 24 through 26. This is called the Aaronic blessing, or the priestly blessing, and it says, "The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace." Amen, and have a good